Hold the line! Shields up! Strike them down! Scotland will not bow, not to Edward, not to any king but his own. They have more men, more horses, more steel, but they do not have the heart of Scotland. They do not fight for their homes, their wives or their children. They fight for money and the whims of a distant king. They call us rebels for fighting for freedom, but today we send them back to England in chains or coffins. In the last years of the 13th century, Scotland was going through a critical moment when Alexander III died accidentally after falling from his horse, leaving his granddaughter Margaret, the Maid of Norway, barely 3 years old, in charge of the kingdom. The Scottish nobility organised a regency in the name of the new sovereign until she was of a suitable age to govern, avoiding a vacuum that could provoke uprisings. But just a few years later, a second tragedy would come to Scotland when the Maid of Norway died at just 7 years old. And just as history has taught us in every succession crisis, the kingdom was divided, and chaos took control of the state. Scotland and England were in constant disputes during that time, which involved regular border changes and tense relations. With Scotland deprived of a sovereign, King Edward I of England took a direct part in the country's affairs, taking advantage of the divisions to assume command until finally a nobleman he trusted was crowned, who swore loyalty to the English crown and earned him the contempt of all the Scottish people. His name was John Balliol. All decisions of the Scottish crown now had to be approved by England, and as was to be expected, when a foreign sovereign decides on foreign lands, problems immediately appeared. England and France were at war, and when Edward I asked for his army to fight the French, John Balliol refused, betraying his loyalty to the English people and allying himself with France. The offence that this betrayal represented for the English king was what provoked his invasion of Scotland in 1296. In his first battle, the English captured John Balliol and abdicated his title as King of Scotland. Edward I took revenge by humiliating him by publicly stripping him of his titles and imprisoning him along with his son. But the humiliation of the traitorous king had not been enough for Edward I. All the people of Scotland had to pay for the betrayal of their crown, stealing the Stone of Destiny, a stone associated with the coronation of Scottish kings, declaring in that act that there would be no more Scottish kings, or that if there were, they would be under the yoke of the English monarchy. More than 2,000 Scottish nobles stood with their arms folded and their heads bowed in loyalty, all except one man whose spirit was indomitable, the Braveheart William Wallace. William Wallace was born around 1270 near Elderslie in Renfrewshire, Scotland. He was the third son of Malcolm Wallace, a landowner with property and rents in Elderslie. He came from a family of minor gentry, meaning Wallace was not a common peasant, but neither did he belong to the powerful aristocracy that shaped national politics. This social position gave him access to some formal education, military training, and the skills expected of a knight, but without the wealth and influence of the great lords of Scotland. Because of his social standing, he received some formal schooling, probably at Paisley Abbey, close to his family's lands. There he would have learned basic Latin, religious teachings and law knowledge, especially land tenure and feudal duties. It is attributed to this education that Wallace acquired a moral sense of freedom through reading classical Latin authors, an ideal that would inspire his fight against English power. Crucially, his education would have included military training, including fencing, archery, and possibly early exposure to guerrilla tactics, skills Wallace would later use to devastating effect. He later married Marion Braidfoot, sometime after his return to the village of his birth in the Scottish Highlands. Historically, not much is known about Wallace before May 1297, when he became involved in the Scottish uprisings against the English. But how did he get to that point? What was life like in Scotland after the English intervention? After Edward defeated John Balliol and installed English officials throughout Scotland, imposing heavy taxes and harsh trade laws that affected the economy, tensions rose as English soldiers occupied the land and English civil servants displaced Scottish jobs. The Scottish nobility came to a quick understanding with the English crown in exchange for maintaining their status and privileges, but the common people, who suffered most from the changed status quo, began to feel burdened by military oppression, and the ground was quickly set for widespread rebellion. Wallace began as a local rebel, participating in small acts of resistance before taking on a more important role. In May 1297, at the age of 27, Wallace committed an act that would be the first spark of a rapidly spreading flame when he stabbed to death an English sheriff of the small Scottish town of Lanark, a man named William Heselrigg. According to Blind Harry's poem, Wallace killed him in revenge for the death of his wife. It is said that Wallace led an uprising in Lanark, and a fight broke out at Heselrigg's court, from which Wallace managed to escape with the help of his wife, who presumably died in the act. Wallace would return to Lanark shortly after in command of 30 followers and launch a coordinated attack where he would attack Heselrigg and his men until finally killing him and setting fire to several government buildings. From here, a series of attacks against the English occupation began, led by William Wallace, who, with his almost 2 meters in height and robust build, would earn him virtual immortality for his bravery and sense of freedom. Following his offensive action at Lanark, Wallace began a media campaign with those peasants opposed to the English and gathered a small army which he led from a military base in the Ettrick Forest. Over the next few months, he inflicted several defeats on the English and quickly became recognized as one of the Scottish leaders in the rebellion. The English increasingly coveted his head. His military campaigns were characterized by guerrilla warfare, strategic ambushes, and bold conventional battles that were effective against the English. Wallace's army entered and left combat very quickly, like a snake that launched its attack and retreated to maintain its defense. Wallace's physical strength and his ability as a fighter in each of these instances are described as a determining player in the strategic field and on the battlefield. But Wallace was not the only leader of the Scottish rebellion. In the north, another brave man called Andrew Moray was also achieving important victories and joined forces with Wallace before the famous battle at Stirling Bridge. While Moray's importance in the rebellion tends to be somewhat overshadowed by the heroic figure of Wallace, he was still a fundamental pillar in the growth of Wallace's army, which was beginning to have problems with the numerical superiority it faced. By the end of the summer of 1297, within months, the English no longer controlled Scottish territory at all. This is demonstrated by a message sent by Edward I, the English king, to one of his most trusted treasurers, Hugh de Cressingham. The message was as follows: "Most of your counties in the Kingdom of Scotland are devoid of officials to govern them, as they have been executed or imprisoned, and some have abandoned their posts, and others neither want nor dare to return. In some counties, the Scots have established ministers and governors who impose laws that cause no other county to be in order." By September 11, 1297, just a few weeks after that message, one of the greatest victories in the history of the liberation of Scotland would occur: the Battle of Stirling Bridge. The Battle of Stirling Bridge is one of the most iconic scenes of the Scottish Rebellion for the impressive feat achieved by an army of peasants with months of constant fighting and difficult conditions regarding rest. Andrew Moray joined Wallace during this confrontation, where they fought in a strategic combat against John de Warenne and Hugh de Cressingham. Even with the combined forces of Moray and Wallace, the English still outnumbered them. The Earl of Surrey, in command of 2,000 horsemen and 7,000 soldiers, tried to cross the River Forth through a wooden bridge near Stirling Castle. The English forces were an advance guard of King Edward I in his attempt to recover the lost Scottish lands. Therefore, the march of this army would be decisive for the English victory, and both Wallace and Moray were aware that with the rebels divided, they could not win. The rebel army consisted of only 5,000 Scots, of whom only 300 were mounted. The bridge was so narrow that it only allowed the English knights to advance 2 by 2. However, Hugh de Cressingham persuaded the Earl of Surrey that this route was safer than going along the river 2 miles further upstream, where dozens of horsemen could have crossed at once, but where the riverbed was wider. Knowing about the size of the bridge, Wallace and Moray waited until a significant portion of the English force had crossed it, before launching a sudden ambush, catching them on the wrong side. The Scots attacked with long spears that redirected the English to the banks of the bridge and collapsed the bridge, causing panic and drowning many soldiers in the river. Wallace had cleverly sabotaged the bridge so that it would fall when needed, and thus prevent the rest of the English army from coming to help. The Earl of Surrey still had half of his army alive on the other side, but seeing what had happened without being able to support his comrades, the morale of the English army plummeted, causing them to retreat. The chronicles claim that 5,000 English died. The animosity between the two nations is reflected in the events that befell the treasurer, Hugh de Cressingham, who, while trying to flee, fell from his horse, was captured, and the Scots tore off his skin in strips and shared them out, not as relics, but for their own ridicule. The number of Scottish casualties is unknown, but it is presumed that they were much lower than the English, except for Andrew Moray, who died from his wounds, putting an end to the leader who defended the north of Scotland until his last breath. After leading a plundering campaign across northern England, Wallace returned to be knighted and sole warden of Scotland, an unusual position for someone outside the great echelons of nobility. Wallace went on to rule a large part of Scotland, reconquered from the English. The English force was insulted by Wallace's ability to direct such strategies, and having been expelled in their entirety from the territory only a year later, Edward I would launch a military campaign to invade Scotland and retake it once and for all, using the totality of his force to wipe out all the nobility and completely reform the Scottish system of government, in order to control and avoid another uprising. In 1298, Edward I invaded Scotland again, at the head of an army of more than 15,000 English. When England began to advance, the English recovered several territories and castles, using looting in small towns to attract the attention of the Protector of Scotland, William Wallace, to confront him in the open field and thus take revenge, but he avoided the confrontation. Wallace was an intelligent man and used the scorched earth strategy to try to make the food shortage force the English to leave. The strategy worked, and King Edward began to move to return for supplies, but he received reports that the leading Scots were in a village near Falkirk, ready to attack the retreating English. So Edward I decided to play all his chances and went to the location where the Scots were to finally confront Wallace. The Scots are estimated to have numbered around 6,000, who were positioned in front of a marshy terrain with a forest behind them, grouped in 3 schiltrums, defensive formations that acted like giant hedgehogs, with their 3-meter-long lances facing the cavalry. According to legend, Wallace told his men, "I've brought you into the ring, now dance as best you can." But he had made the mistake of ceding the initiative to the enemy. The English cavalry launched an attack, and things began to go wrong in Scotland's favour. To begin with, the majority of the Scottish cavalry was made up of noble troops of dubious loyalty to Wallace, since after having expelled the English from their territory, the same nobles who had bowed their heads to Edward now did the same to Wallace, in addition to the fact that many had relatives held hostage by the English. Most of them left the battlefield without engaging in combat. The archers held their ground, but were soon crushed by the cavalry. Still, The Schiltrums held firm and killed hundreds of English horses in the charges against the spear walls. When the English cavalry cleared the way, the English archers started hurling projectiles at the Scottish army that made up the Schiltrums, and they started to fall because Edward had included Welsh longbows in his army, which had a far longer range than other bows. The Scots could neither retreat nor defend, only wait for death to come. Finally, the English entered among the Schiltrums, and, faced with such a threat, the Scots finally decided to flee, dispersing among them Wallace. 2 months after his brutal defeat at Falkirk, Wallace renounced his title of Protector of Scotland in favour of 2 men, John Comyn, nephew of John Balliol, and Robert I the Bruce, future King of Scotland and defender of the people whom Wallace led to their liberation. Over the next few years, Wallace did not sit idly by in the face of Edward I's invasion and travelled to France to the court of Philip IV in order to seek support for the Scottish cause. By 1304, Wallace continued to fight in minor skirmishes and avoided capture by the English. Finally, in August 1305, a Scottish knight, a traitor to his country and loyal to the English throne, betrayed Wallace's whereabouts and handed him over to the English army at Roboyston. The traitor's name was John Menteith. Wallace was taken to London and charged with having committed atrocities in war and with betraying the king, a charge for which one is sentenced to death without trial. With his will and pride still alive, Wallace simply declared, "I cannot be a traitor to Edward because I was never his subject." That same day he was executed, and his death was one of the cruelest in history, being dragged from the royal court to the execution square by a horse, while the English offspring insulted him and stoned him along the way. When he arrived, the executioner suffocated him until he was almost dead, but without doing it, so that he would still feel the pain of having his intestines removed and burned while Wallace maintained his will to live. Finally, as a final humiliation, his heart was removed and his head cut off, which was displayed on a pike on top of London Bridge, and the rest of his body was mutilated, with limbs sent to different places in Scotland to be displayed before the people he so defended. The Scottish struggle was not diminished by the death of one of its most daring leaders, and there was no popular protest. Perhaps because the Scots felt defeated, intimidated and exhausted by the prolonged war. However, Wallace's legacy and struggle were maintained through Robert the Bruce, whom Wallace succeeded as defender of Scotland. He would become King of Scotland and be the one who would finally defeat Edward II, the son of Edward I, and the English troops at the Battle of Bannockburn. After years of negotiations, in the Treaty of Northampton of 1328, the English agreed to the total independence of Scotland. Robert the Bruce died only a year after achieving the objective for which William Wallace died, and it was he who posthumously adopted the iconic name of Braveheart throughout history. The nickname Braveheart, although historically it belonged to Robert I, is currently more attributed to Wallace due to the popular adaptation of the story of William Wallace, starring and directed by Mel Gibson in 1995, demonstrating the historical significance of Scotland's hero. In 1869, very close to where the Battle of Stirling took place, the Wallace Monument was erected, a tower where a supposed sword that was carried by the leader of the Scottish Rebellion himself is displayed. William Wallace, although a victim of his oppressors and executed in such a horrible way, remains today not only a national hero, but a figure installed in history and popular culture that symbolizes the eternal fight against oppression. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's coming next. Thank you all for watching. If there's a historical figure you'd like to see featured next, or if you have any thoughts to share, feel free to leave a comment below. I'll see you in the next video.